This is the Get a Life podcast. Ex-Cult Conversations.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Get a Life podcast, Ex-Cult Conversations. We are joined today by Richard and Carmen, and we have actually two special guests today. Our first special guest is Ben, who is a former student of OSG, and we have a former OSG teacher that is joining us. And we are going to dive into this teacher's experience working for OneSchool Global. And we also want to let all the other teachers that have contacted us before that this is a platform and a method that we can get your stories out to the public while still remaining anonymous. So anybody who has contacted us before and would like to do this, please email us again and we will book you in. I'm going to hand this over to Ben. Take it away, Ben.
Thank you, Cheryl. Firstly, I would like to just edit that I was a former student of MET school, so Medibank Education Trust, which then merged or renamed, because they like to rename, rebrand when things get sticky, to OSG, OneSchool Global. So you say potato, I say potato, same thing. But yes, so I was a former student. I graduated in 2009, and it was one of the worst experiences of my life in that schooling system. I've had many experiences. I've been out of the cult 7 years, and going to the Brethren High School was probably one of the worst experiences I've ever had to date. But the highlights, looking back, were teachers. The highlights, the reasons I didn't end my life in the darkest moments at that school were the teachers. Not that I confided in them with what I was battling, because I knew that the teachers had no sort of safety net to speak to or to elevate an issue like that, because I knew that teachers before, had spoken about somebody being abused or had spoken about somebody who was maybe battling with their sexuality, and then it was either handled by the Brethren CEOs, and then if the teacher pursued it any further, they would just disappeared. So I know that I just want to say thank you. I know that a lot of teachers do watch this, and I just want to say, as a former student, thank you. I'm sorry, I don't mean to get emotional over it, but you were my saving grace, and I thank you so much, because in what was a barren circumstance, in what was one of the toughest periods of my life, you were the glimmers of hope, you were the glimmers of reality. And whilst you didn't know what to do or how to handle us kids, thank you, because I'm here today because of teachers. And you coming forward like this, and as you're going to see from our teacher, yes, we can protect your anonymity. It's anonymous. You are starting and part of a mass change that needs to happen, because whilst, yes, I was sexually abused at this school, I didn't even get the worst of what kids got. So thank you. And I would like to hand over to our very, very brave teacher.
Ben, you just broke my heart.
Sorry.
No, I don't want to say in a good way, because obviously your experiences are not good, but knowing that teachers are, can be the light of the world is one of the reasons why we do what we do. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that. That's really special. And I think that's something that the community in general, not within the Brethren community, but in general, is something that the community tends to forget. So it's really kind of you to say those things. So my experience with the Brethren Church, if you can't tell by my accent, I'm Australian, is that a teacher resigned along with many, many others during our lockdown times. And so there was a mad scramble to find a teacher. At that time, I had actually left my previous school, which was not within the Brethren system, but was within the independent system, because there's a lot of pressures there too that aren't great. Different story, different time. So found myself in need of work. They were initially advertising for a terms work with a very strong indication that the successful applicant would be continued on into work. That didn't happen for me, and I'll get to why, or their reasoning, in a moment. But the first thing that struck me when I first came in was that this school looked different to anything that I had ever experienced, whether it be independent Catholic schools or government schools. It looked spectacular. But saying that, there was some weird things. Now, when I walked into the campus, because I couldn't actually go into the campus until 2 weeks after I'd started my employment because of the lockdown situations, I was struck by the fact that there was 2 kitchens, and there was a very clear sign on the door, teaching staff not to enter. So that kitchen, which was actually the closest to the area where I worked, and there was also toilets that said staff are not to enter. Those were the toilets that were assigned solely for members of the church, the Plymouth Brethren Church. Now, I suffer from a medical condition that requires me to be able to need to go to the toilet fairly quickly. And that was the first time I got in trouble working there. I'd only been there a week and a half, and I said to my colleagues, I really need to go to the bathroom, and I ran. And I used that bathroom, not realising or understanding why. For those that don't know, if you're not within the church, you're seen as inferior and as less, even though I have a teaching degree and a master's degree, which no one within the church, as I came to find out, actually has. I was lambasted by not the head of the campus, who's also obviously an educator, but by one of 2 members of the church who were very much involved in the day-to-day runnings of the school. They were there every day, and they were overseeing what was happening in the school every single day. They were male members of the church too, which again made me feel very uncomfortable, because I felt like I was working within a business, not within an educational institution. These are just minor things that started raising my red flags. So we weren't allowed to use those bathrooms. We weren't allowed to use those toilets. We weren't allowed to go into the same areas and we weren't to eat with the children or the members of the staff who were brethren. So, for example, members of staff that were brethren, there was a lot of support staff who I don't know how they actually got qualified because they didn't do much, that were education support staff. There was also the reception staff. And for those that haven't experienced the Brethren way of doing things when it comes to school, and I always found this quite hilarious. The first time I saw it, I actually laughed out loud, was that children will travel for far and wide to come to a campus. In some cases, those children were traveling 2 hours a day to come to the campus, and they all arrived in white minivans, and they were exactly the same model and exactly the same year. And parents would take it in turns to drive the minibuses. Now, at the campus where I worked, there were 26 minibuses. There were 26 parks, numbered 1 to 26, out the front. We were not permitted to park in those parks, and for any reason, there was one park that was set aside for deliveries only. So we were not allowed to park out the front of the school. The day that I was allowed to come into the campus and I bought some of my own personal teaching things in, I was actually told that I needed to move my car and that we were not permitted to park there under any reason, which I had to walk a long way to take my stuff in.
And I can attest for those detestful minibus rides to work.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I thought it was horrendous that we had kids that were coming from nearly 2 hours away to go to school in the first place. The process of education for kids is exhausting. Any of those that have children ourselves know that they are tired and they are hungry and they are grumpy when they get home, because the load on their little brains, on their little developing brains to understand what's happening, that's a big enough task for a child. But adding 2 hours both ways is enough. But those minivans, and it was almost like a ballet. The children had to be signed on by the teachers to ensure that they were on the correct minibus. They all knew anyway. But then the first one would pull out, then the second, and it was in concert. They would all pull out at the same time, and then they would all leave at the same time. They wouldn't pull out, like, for example, bus 17 wouldn't pull out first and then go. No, they had to wait for buses 1 to 16 to leave. So,
Sounds like
it was
something from Willy
like bus
Wonka.
ballet. Yeah, it was almost like bus ballet. Like I said, the first time I saw it, I laughed out loud and called it bus ballet. And that's something that, the teachers that I still have contact with, only one is still there. We call it bus ballet. So, that was always hilarious. But the other area that we weren't permitted to enter as teachers was there was an area that was set aside for remote work. So the parents would take it in turns. I'm assuming that there was some sort of roster that we weren't privy to, where the parents had space to work. Now, one thing I learned fairly quickly on is that the brethren that work only work for brethren businesses. So a large majority of them were working in the set aside working space, so that they didn't have to waste time traveling back the 2 hours that they'd already driven and then circle around again. So they had a specific working space that was set aside. One thing that I was really surprised at, and one misconception that I had about the Brethren, was that there was, and this was probably different to your experience at school, Ben, was that technology is used. And I was under the misconception that there was no technology use. And I don't know when that changed, because, as I said, I was coming in knowing nothing. But it was very limited. So, for example, each classroom had a TV. When I say classroom, it was designed very much to look like a modern learning space. So, as I said, brand new school, open learning spaces, which teachers hate because it's not good for our voices. It's not good for classroom control either, as far as, like being able to actually get your message across to the kids. So there was TVs in every classroom that we used with a school supplied laptop that was checked remotely every week to make sure that we weren't using it for inappropriate reasons.
Was it an open laptop, or was it one of the Brethren controlled ones?
No, it was a Brethren controlled laptop. So that's what I mean. It was Brethren controlled, and
so limited internet.
We had internet, but for example, if I wanted to watch a YouTube video about a subject, so we were looking at Australian history, for example, which is part of one thing that the school has to do, is they have to follow the Australian curriculum, which must be a really interesting challenge, because there's some things in the curriculum, particularly that as you go higher up in the teaching, that I know don't match the Brethren thinking, as far as, for example, biology and geology.
The Charles Darwin theory. And I remember our science teacher just going, "This is Charles Darwin. He believes that animals became humans." End of chapter. Okay, now on to, that's the extent of their, fulfilling the curriculum.
Exactly. But if I wanted to, for example, watch a YouTube video as part of learning, for example, about Australian history, I had to have watched it thoroughly, which I would do anyway. B, submit for approval to view it, and then I had to download it at home to be able to watch it. There was pre-approved things that we were allowed to use, as far as internet sources are concerned. We were allowed to use something called ClickView, which a lot of schools have access to, and they've all been screened already. But then there was a Brethren screening on top of that. So, so there was certain videos that we weren't able to access within ClickView that's already been designed for school use. Teacher Flicks, which is a newer, I'm sure you can work out by the name what that's supposed to represent, which again is a very similar and newer platform. We would not have been allowed to use that because it wouldn't have been screened. But there was someone that was employed somewhere within that organisation that went through the entire ClickView catalogue and said this is okay and this is not okay.
And that would have been OSG head office.
Yeah.
Which is still run by PBCC members.
Yes, absolutely.
Just for the viewers and listeners to know.
Yes. And that comes back to, the members of the PBCC that were really involved in the school and were there every day and were basically looking over our shoulders to make sure that we didn't say or do anything that was outside of the scope of where our influence on the kids was seen to be okay. The thing that I think that from my perspective anyway, in the time I was there, that the PBCC members hated was the fact that because they don't go on to university and they don't get qualifications, they could not teach their own kids. They hated that with a passion because we know how closed the community is.
Yeah.
If they were allowed to teach their own children, they would do it. But they are not allowed to. They have to have qualified teachers. And the scrutiny that teachers are under in that context is really difficult. And for me, that's one of the reasons that at a time when teachers are leaving the profession for a million other reasons, conversation for another day, that so many teachers are leaving one school and going to other schools that still have their passion for teaching, but had it crushed teaching at OneSchool Global. On that note, or some feedback I've heard recently, and I have heard, from teachers that have left OneSchool Global, they've found it really difficult to get jobs at other schools because OSG obviously has its reputation within the schooling industry and the teaching industry. And would this be correct in me saying this, because this is obviously just what I've heard, feedback from other teachers, is that they've found it really difficult to find jobs because schools are like, how did you work for that school for so long? Like, we don't want somebody that you obviously at some point aligned or shared their values. So they've found it really hard to get jobs, or they've been knocked back because they actually worked for OneSchool Global. Have you heard that? That's not something that I experienced previously. And I suppose in my case, I was lucky that I'd been teaching for a long time. And when I came in to the OneSchool system, I already had that experience. However, I can understand why that might happen. And from my perspective as someone who teaches and works with panels to employ teachers, it would be more about the lack of experiences that teachers are given with regards to current trends in education. So what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example, and please let me know if I'm going over people's and listeners' heads here. There's a push within the education sector for something called science of reading at the moment. And this is coming back to looking at reading of being more than, what does this picture tell me within the book? Now can you work the word out? Now that's an example of how kids have been taught to read for a long time. What the science of reading will actually do is gasp, use actual phonics. Now it took OneSchool Global a good 10 years to get to where schools are starting to move away from. So in that area. So my thinking would be that it would be difficult for teachers who have been there for a long time to move on because they simply don't have the professional understanding or the professional.
That makes sense.
To be able to move forward into another school. They would probably have to do a lot of professional development. I can't speak for teachers in other schools, but they would be somewhat supported by different professional organisations around Australia to undertake that professional development. But if they were applying to other schools, and I know this for a fact that happens because I've got a friend who's been applying to get out for a while, that she's been knocked back, and she's a very experienced teacher, but she simply just doesn't have the current knowledge to be able to step into a classroom and be able to teach in a way that's supported by current research. She just doesn't have that knowledge. And the professional development of teachers within the organisation is non-existent. They don't see it as important. On
hearing this, it's not unfamiliar. It's not dissimilar to all of our situations, leaving what is a very 1960s mindset religious group or cult, and then stepping into the real world, where you have social settings and you have other experiences that we just aren't allowed to experience. It's not dissimilar, this story. It's the very same process whereby members go through from when they leave the cult to going out into the real world.
Oh, absolutely. And I can see that I could see that in the kids that were 8 years old, that were coming into the system. One of the things that I really struggled with was within Australia, you have to have evidence that your child is being educated from, and that will vary from state to state. But generally it's around 5 years old. That your child must be in some sort of formalised education. That can be homeschool, that can be within the independent, Catholic or government systems, but you have to have evidence. So what's happening for kids that are coming into the OneSchool system is they're going to government schools because we don't want our children's view of religion being sullied by a different religion. That's not okay. So they're going to government schools, which are non-secular. And so they're being taken from an environment where thinking is encouraged, critical thinking is encouraged, investigating the world in different ways. They're being ripped from that environment within school and then put within the OneSchool system, where there's no critical thinking encouraged.
Mm-hmm.
There's no opportunity to investigate the world at large because it is so closed. So that's incredibly hard for an 8-year-old, incredibly hard.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of push from the parents at the time that I was there to make it a one-stop shop so that the kids weren't exposed to the external world at all. And I could never work out why they started it at year 3 anyway. And no one could even answer the question why that happened. It just didn't make sense to me. You guys can probably shed more light on that because I don't know. But yeah, it just seemed really odd to me.
It's just was something set on by the leadership, the golden advice or whatever they call it that comes from the leader. It's at that point I think kids start questioning and start to form their own, taste, scent, touch, smell. They really start to question, and they want to be in control of that from the outset, and they do. You're right about critical thinking. The only critical thinking they ever encourage, and they do harbor, actually encapsulate that and turn it inwards. They put the critical thinking inwards. So you are spending all your time not critically analyzing the world or the religion you're in. It's yourself. Mm-hmm. So you're so caught up with critically analyzing yourself, you don't have time to question it.
Yeah, exactly. An example of that, I mean, obviously I teach younger kids, but I would work with the older kids, covering relief and things like that. But an example of that within the curriculum within Australia, you must teach kids around the levels of government and how government works within the country. We had to be really careful with what we said and what we did with that one. There was specific guidelines as to what we were allowed to talk about and what we were allowed to talk about.
So interesting.
And how did those guidelines come to you? Like, did you have to submit your lesson plans, or was there a meeting, or did you find out through trial and error? Like, how did those guidelines come to you?
There's a head of department, right, or something.
Yeah. So because because the school is formed as OneSchool Global, the schools that I work with are up and down the east coast of Australia. So from as far as Cairns right through to Tasmania. And the way that we would communicate was via Zoom. And we would have Zoom meetings after school 3 times a week. And one of those was planning. So we would plan with colleagues from Cairns and from New South Wales, along the Murray, like right across the east coast of Australia. And during those meetings, the curriculum leaders would tell us that this is what's approved by the church and this is what isn't approved by the church as far as teaching. And I can only imagine that when it came to subjects, I was mentioning before the science or the strands of science, there was no psychology offered at all. That was not offered as a subject at a secondary level at all. And that's one of the 6 branches of science, obviously. Biology was very limited. Anything that was study of the earth, geography, geology, that was very much, this is what the church will approve. This is what they won't approve as far as the teaching and learning was allowed, what we were allowed to be teaching. And if our own opinion slipped in there, big rack over the knuckles.
That's what I was going to ask. Did you or any other teacher try and change their perceptions or change their way of what they viewed was important to teach and what wasn't important to teach?
Yeah. So an example of that, and we'll get back, I want to circle back to this because there was a number of students who had diagnoses, for example, on the autism spectrum. And I want to talk about how children with disabilities were dealt with. And I'm going to say the word dealt with because they weren't supported. But for example, one of the things that I really make sure to try and develop a love of reading with my kids is to teach them how to browse a library and find books that they're interested in so that they learn to love reading. So it's not something that's foisted on them. A lot of kids, the only things that they'd read were church-approved versions of the Bible. We did have a
Pilgrim's Progress.
Yeah. That, oh God, Pilgrim's Progress. Yeah. God, that takes me back to Little Women. Good Lord.
I wasn't allowed to read Little Women.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you wouldn't have been allowed to read Little Women because the women actually had some purpose and some knowledge in that book, but you would have been allowed to read Pilgrim's Progress.
Yeah.
So we did have.
And some gay.
Yeah.
It's their fault. I wasn't allowed to read Little Women.
We're going to blame Louisa May Alcott for making you, in inverted commas, gay, Ben. That's hilarious.
It was the John Bunyan's pictorial pictures of the man without any clothes on, or he just had his loin cloth. You know what?
Yeah, well, look, I don't think it mattered which religion you're exposed to as a child, but I tell you what, those pictures, they were a sexual awakening for a lot of
It was John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. See, if they just let me read Little Women.
You would have been fine, right?
I would have realized that women were allies earlier.
Yeah, I'm really surprised they let you read Little Women because, the fact that
no, they didn't. They didn't.
Oh, they didn't. I was going to say, I thought they did. I was going to say because the characters in Little Women, first of all, obviously women do, but the fact that they're independent of thought and they're encouraged to actually do the good.
Well, they're ahead of their time as well.
Yeah. Oh, it's well ahead of its time. But they do the good of religion. For example, the time when there's a family that doesn't have any food at Christmas, so they give up their meal at Christmas time. But then,
what's Christmas?
But also, but also there's the part where the main character, whose name escapes me at the moment, but she goes on to study journalism. I mean, that's not something that anyone in the church.
Proto-feminist.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Before feminism was a word, Louise May Alcott was a feminist.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
what were we talking about? I've forgotten now.
Okay,
Sorry,
let's go
I
back to
distracted
these
you.
unsupported people with disabilities.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So, oh, that's right. So, encourage the kids to browse. We had a library. It was a pretty good library, but it was very restricted as far as subject matter is concerned. So, for example, in Australia, we observe Anzac Day. Anzac stands for Australia and New Zealand Military Corps, and that's been observed since 1918 after the loss of life of Australian and New Zealand soldiers in World War I. Now, in every school that I've ever worked in, whether the kids are 5-year-old or 18-year-old, there's always an observance of Anzac Day. There is teaching around Anzac Day, whether it's reading a picture storybook or something like that. There was no books about Anzac Day, nothing. That's just an example. Anyway, this student who was ASD was very fixated, which is pretty standard of a diagnosis within that area, on certain topics and certain subjects. So I was trying to expand her understanding of what worldview looks like, not from the point of view of trying to step on toes or anything like that, but you're interested in this certain topic. Let's try and read some books about something else to help you to become a more engaged reader, but help you to find something else that you might be interested in. I got an email from one of these heads of campuses, and the email stated, please don't let student X exit the classroom. Mind you, these were open learning spaces, so there was no physical walls. The physical space was delineated by a half wall with no door, because of her diagnosis. So the message was loud and clear that because this child was different, they needed to be controlled. They needed to be kept an eye on. They weren't to wander, in inverted commas, because that meant that that child, who, and with those of us that work with kids with special needs, they need those experiences to be able to develop and foster their learning. She wasn't being given those opportunities. The other thing about that child, single parent, who'd been born into PSG, the church, but she was a single parent. Now, that was pretty much unheard of, and I'm sure that from your perspectives, that's something that's pretty much unheard of too. So not only was this child seen as lesser because she had a diagnosis, but she was seen as lesser because she didn't have dad in the picture.
Yeah.
So that child was being singled out for so many reasons, and the kids themselves would single her out. She wasn't, the other kids weren't encouraged to build friendships with her.
And that was the case in my schooling life from year 7 to 12. Every kid with the slightest disability was bullied within an inch of their life. It's one thing to be slightly gay, which is what I was bullied for, or slightly effeminate. And this is like, I don't know how else to say it, but you used to almost be relieved when somebody else would come into the school that was less fortunate than yourself. And you just knew that it would be a little break for at least a week while that person was bullied to no end. And there were kids that were suicidal over it, kids that didn't understand their autism, kids that didn't understand their disability, because obviously the Brethren are so limited in their knowledge of disability. Yeah. They are just in normal human interaction, let alone somebody with a disability, and how to create a safe space for that kid to process what they are or what they're dealing with or what their disabilities are.
Yeah, so exactly. And I think that, that's society wide as well. Like I look back on my own experiences and my own, even at the start of my teaching career, and you'll get some boomers who'll make comments like, How come so many kids are being diagnosed? There wasn't that many kids back, 20 years ago or 30 years ago. That's because, like any medical investigation, knowledge grows and knowledge learns, and there's more things understood as time goes by. However, these poor kids within the Brethren, my experience was that it was shameful, considered to be shameful to be different. And as you're saying, Ben, they would be bullied. There was nothing done about it within the community. And if you stood up to it as a teacher, if you did anything about it as a teacher, then you'd get a rap over the knuckles for it. That was made pretty much evident straight away that bullying.
I remember in year 7, a teacher sticking up for kids like myself that were bullied, or a girl that was bullied for her weight, another girl that was bullied because she ended up having cancer. But there were people like that were bullied, and this teacher continually stuck up for them. She just was disappeared. She just went.
Yep.
And I just thought she was the only person that cared. I remember crying at home after hearing that she'd left, because, well, then the one teacher that took an interest, but that's the trouble. And you'd probably be able to attest for that. When you pay too much attention to the kids, when you show too much interest, more than just your job, because you are more than just your job, you are human.
Exactly.
You are then, given the rap over the knuckles and then ultimately disappeared.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what happened to me, but we'll come back to that. Yeah, Cheryl, yeah.
I was just saying, would you say that when you witness the bullying and when you witness the hardship some of these kids go through, would you say that it's a hierarchical system, that where the bullies or the people that you see have their dads at the top, or their families are at the top, or they're more wealthy? Would you say that you witness that?
Oh, 100%. So the student that I was just discussing, I had another student in my classroom that had similar diagnoses. However, the family was very wealthy and they were very high up in the church. So the other kids would leave them alone. When it came to this other student, because it was a single parent, I wasn't privy as to why it was a single parent. I'm not sure whether there was a death or there was a divorce, which, like with my limited understanding of what happens within the church, I'm assuming that a divorce would be very much a scandal. I do know that that partners are picked by within the church, and I do know from whispers amongst staff that abuse within marriages is very much tolerated. But this other student whose family were extremely wealthy and very high up in the hierarchy of the church, they were left alone. But when it came to this other child, because this other child was a single parent family and the family wasn't as wealthy and obviously not as high up in the church, it was she was at the center of a lot of people's ire.
Yeah, and they don't allow, just for the viewers and listeners, they don't allow divorces in there. I think we only know of one divorce that's ever happened in there. In this case, if she wasn't a widow, then most likely the dad was on the outside, right?
By divorce, Cheryl, we're talking about if a wife, they call them widows of the truth. If your husband leaves you, you're allowed the divorce because he left you and has gone out and he's the devil. We're talking about the only divorce we know of is a woman that stood up to the church and said, I'm not going back to him.
Yeah, he was an abuser.
And she was given a divorce and she's still in. So we're talking about they're both still in, but allowed a divorce. So it's not allowed. But back to your point about depending on what part of the echelon within that society you are, as to whether you're bullied or not, if you are of a disability, that is so true. And I witnessed this at my school, where a certain family were of what we would call the bottom tier of the echelon, where they had no money. They were a certain family. They were always mocked. One of the brothers had autism. The girls were ill. Now, it wasn't until somebody from the upper echelons of that society then took her under her wing and made, such a spectacle of being her friend, that family were then put up with that bracket, and obviously the leader had a lot to do with them and spoke to them at church meetings. Then they were left alone. But prior to that, they were bullied so much just because they had no money, just because they were, this family. And it wasn't until, somebody from the upper echelons of that society extends a hand down to somebody lower. It's not until, that fortunate day that they are then given any reprieve from it. And that you've got to be on death's door for that. Like, it's a big showcase.
Yeah. And I can imagine that the false charity that would come with that. And there was lots of examples of that. For example, I can't remember the name of the Brethren charity, but
Rapid Relief Team.
That's the one.
We see this today, we see this online, and we're constantly talking about it, where they are posing for Christmas photos. We know that we were given a recent letter that went around saying you must confess if you've ever shared photos or had photos celebrating Christmas. Like the hypocrisy is black and white. Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say, because it was during a tough time for a lot of families. People had lost jobs, so there was a big song and dance about the Rapid Relief Team providing meals for families who, outside of the outside of the church. And I'll come back to the effect of COVID on the church financially and the schools financially in a minute, but a big song and dance and publicity about how they were providing meals. Now, mind you, and those of you who were not in Australia, you may not know this, but the Sikh community in Australia were incredible during lockdowns, incredible. The only thing that they publicised was, we need ingredients to be able to cook meals. They weren't making a big song and dance, and they did so much more work than maybe the once a week we'll go out and provide 100 meals type deal, which is what the Rapid Relief Team was doing. But the hypocrisy of that to make themselves look fabulous, that was horrendous. And they were using the kitchens within the school to create those meals. I also found that really interesting too, with the whole, we don't eat with, I don't want to say Gentiles, because that's not the correct term. What is the correct term for those of us that are not heathens?
The worldlies,
yeah,
or the worldlies.
The worldlies.
Yeah, so they were sullying the kitchens, which were, I've got to say, the kitchens for food tech and stuff, which come back to traditional roles, they were amazing. The food tech programs were incredible, but it was only girls that did them. The boys weren't allowed to do them.
I did do them in Year 9, much to my parents' disgust. It was why can't you do metals and engineering like all the other boys? And then I did ceramics in Year 11 and 12. I mean, what about that didn't tell you I was gay?
Whereas now, within, teaching in different sectors, no one would bat an eyelid with a boy doing food tech. No one would care. They would think, he wants to be a chef.
Exactly. That's what I was going to,
there'd be none of that. But the fact that they sullied their kitchens with, food for the unholy, as a big show and dance. The other one that I found hilarious too, which they were still pushing on that Rapid Relief Team, was, as we know, Australia experienced some horrific bushfires that soon became forgot about because COVID hit. And when I was looking up and finding out what I was getting myself into, that was front and center on all the websites. How much work they'd done within as the Rapid Relief Team. But when you dug deeper, that relief was only for families of Brethren families who'd been in those areas. It wasn't for the unholy. So that was quite funny. The campuses were going through. You mentioned right at the start, Ben, they like to rename to cover things up. So they started
Well, we
building.
have it with their own name, Exclusive Brethren to Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. And it's only because if you Google Exclusive Brethren, there's nothing positive that comes up.
No. So they built a new campus, which interestingly is next to the church, which of course none of us ever saw the inside of. So that was interesting in itself. But that was all about smart business decisions and being the facility that they moved from was sold to another to an independent school. And they didn't have to do a lot to it other than improve the internet and technology that was available. They even left all the furniture there. They just walked out and shut the door. And they'd spent a lot of money in there. And I remember teachers saying that they were disappointed that they'd left certain resources because they were so useful, but they were just left behind. They just walked out and shut the doors. And that was all about a renaming. That was really odd. And people talk about the Brethren being savvy business people, but that was demonstrated such a really poor business decision. It just didn't make sense. But it was all about appearances. And coming back to what I was saying before, it was built to look amazing. Mm-hmm. It did look amazing, but when you got under the prettiness and looked at the layers, it wasn't pretty. Even down to the kids coming in from playing, there was a boys' door where the boys had to line up and a girls' door where the girls had to line up.
It's so 1950s.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
But this is their mindset, right? Yeah. Even at high school, boys and girls weren't allowed to play together. And I hated hanging out with the boys because I was bullied so much. So I used to find refuge in hanging out with my cousins or the girls. And it was always the teacher would come over, Ben, you've got to go outside and play with the others. You can't be in here. So I'd go and hide in the toilets all lunch.
Yeah. That is a perfect example of how bizarre what's being expected in the schools. The other one, having taught in schools that are religious schools. So, for example, I'd worked within the Catholic system previously. Teachers are actively engaged in teaching aspects of the religion within schools, for example, in the Catholic sector. If it's an Anglican school, if it's an Islamic school, whatever, the teachers are directly, it's an expectation that you will teach religious education in those schools. We had no input whatsoever in that area. We were explicitly told we were not to mention religion at all under any circumstances. Yet we were being expected to uphold certain expectations of the religion. For example, you mentioned before, Ben, that you weren't allowed to hang out with the girls. A big one that was a problem at secondary level, not so much at primary, but at secondary, was forming of relationships, and that's not allowed. That's a natural progression.
Yeah.
That's natural. If you look back into history that the Brethren would dispute around cave people and at the ages that they would first start mating, if we're talking, because, we're descended from apes. And so, people would first start mating when around, 10 to 13 years old. That's natural that human beings are going to show interest in whoever they are attracted to, whichever gender they're attracted to. But the fact that we had to police that while we weren't allowed to discuss anything to do with the religion was so hypocritical. It was ridiculous. And again, those two members of the community that were so involved with the school, who, by the way, were running their businesses from the school campus. They had a specific area above the gym that was set up as their office.
Wow.
And they were running their business from the campus. That was intimidating, and you always felt like you were walking in eggshells because you didn't know whether you were understepping, overstepping, whether you were doing something that you shouldn't have been doing.
It's kind of like Big Brother, but in the workforce.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And coming back to Big Brother, when I first started, in a brown paper bag, a colleague gave me the book written by a former Big Brother contestant in Australia who had got
David Chapat.
Yes. And that was my introduction to what the Brethren are really like. And then I started seeing the signs of some things that were really worrying to me. Did you read that book when it first came out? No. It was given to me when I first started. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Because a really interesting side story to that is I was in his niece's class, and I remember her telling us how devastated they were when the book came out, and her and her mum and all her sister and whatever went to the shops, and they got all the books and chucked them under the book display so nobody could find them. But I was like, they're just going to order more in.
Of course. So really they're supporting him financially, like in a roundabout way by, very
not realising they weren't. Yeah, that wasn't the objective.
No, of course. I wanted to get it out of people's sight. But if they were ordering more copies, then bizarre.
So you read this book and it started opening your
I read
eyes.
the book, and some things that he mentioned in the book really started standing out to me. Obviously, the first one was about abuse in marriage. I remember seeing a lot of women, obviously never saw a woman out of a skirt. But I would see a lot of women in long sleeves in very warm weather. I would see tokens that would cover parts of faces. So physical abuse was being hidden. And they didn't talk to us other than saying hello. This was
just to outsiders. Token is a headpiece that the brethren have to wear, the women have to wear, so that when the angels look down, they will recognize who is the weaker sex, because women are weaker and the lesser sex, they need the protection, hence the token. Sorry, I thought I'd add that bit in.
No, that's all right. When we had school photos taken when I was there, it was quite late in the year because of the lockdowns. They hadn't been able to been done previously, but the tokens and the hairstyles for school photo day were some of the funniest 80s throwbacks that I had seen in such a long time. They were hilarious.
Very musical.
Oh, it reminded me of you'll see 80s videos with people doing aerobics, for example, and the big hair, the big curls and that sort of stuff. That was exactly what it's like. Like on 10-year-old kids. I was like, what the hell? Anyway.
There a saying, the higher hair, the closer to God.
Yes. We've heard that saying before. But I must admit, it was I had to bite my tongue very hard that day to not laugh at the kids, which is really unkind to the kids because they're in a situation that they can't control. But the hair was hilarious. So the abuse, physical abuse, and the other one is because and I've mentioned this to you, Ben, previously, that the vices that were allowed are abused very much. The first one is alcoholism, and even boys who were at the school were drinking heavily. You could tell if they'd been drinking heavily the night before because they would come in and you could see the signs of a hangover. Which contributed to the level of abuse. Now, if you're forced to marry someone that you would never have chosen, I'm in no way condoning abuse, don't get me wrong, but I can sort of understand why that was starting to happen because the frustration level, of being
on both sides. You also taught from a young age that alcohol is okay because it's, ingrained in you that it, and I quote from one of the leaders, alcohol makes a strong man stronger and a weak man weaker. Well, it only feeds into that, egotistical part of a young, testosterone-filled young boy growing up thinking, well, I'm a man, you know, I can handle it, I'm a strong man. And then feel that comes frustration and anger from being, you know, having their marriage approved, whilst they say their marriages aren't chosen for them. They are most certainly approved, which is no different to being chosen. And stuck in that. And the only way to cope with that is the vice of alcohol. And it's also alcohol, consuming a lot of alcohol is a form of self-harm.
Yes.
Like it's psychologically proven and explained as a type of self-harm.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could see it not only in, like I mentioned, older boys, but the fathers who were working from, it was called, in inverted commas, the office. So I mentioned that space where we weren't allowed to enter, that remote space where people could work during the school day so that they weren't wasting their time travelling backwards and forwards. The other vice that I was horrified by that's allowed is food. Now, I'm not one to police kids' lunchboxes, and I don't put a value on food. Food is food. However, the parents put on a special lunch for the kids, which is a normal thing within school communities across the country. You know, for example, at Easter, you might be able to order a special lunch order from the canteen that has a hot cross bun in it. But for those of us that work in schools, we also know that there are very clear guidelines as to what you can and can't sell in school canteens and what you can and can't provide kids on a regular basis, as far as, you know, like what's considered to be healthy food and things like that. So on this special lunch day, the food was pizza, which by itself would have been fine. The drink was Coke, full cans of Coke. The kids were also given quite expensive ice creams, like things like, for those of us who are in Australia will know Magnum straight away, but it's a really very delicious ice cream, premium ice cream that's coated in different types of chocolate. There was...
I put a few of those away myself.
Yes, they are good. So for lunch, these kids had pizza, a full can of Coke, so full sugar soft drink. It didn't just have to be Coke. They had a choice between that and Fanta, which is an orange drink for those not in Australia or Europe, lemonade, whatever they chose, but it was full sugar. They also had an ice cream. There was a lot of nut offerings, which, you know, we've got to be careful with, because if a kid has a nut allergy, it can cause anaphylaxis and that child can die. And then to top it off, we finished with a jam donut. Now, for those of us who are not Australian, I'm not sure whether you have these. It'd be similar to a Nutella donut, but it's deep fried. So it's deep fried. It's got jam or jelly injected into the middle, and then it's coated in sugar. So that was the special lunch.
Good luck to the teachers in the afternoon.
Exactly. We just gave up and we just took them outside to play, to run it off.
Yeah, you'd
but
have
secondly,
to.
we had kids who were physically sick because of the amount of calories and the amount of food that was given to them as a special lunch. And Ben, you mentioned, like kids were picked on for being overweight. The number of overweight kids at the school was really concerning to me, and the fact that they don't compete in sports outside of other campuses. So Ben, I'm sure you remember all the big sports day.
Yeah, I do. My favorite part was the canteen.
Yep. So all the campuses will come together for a one-day athletics carnival each year. That's their only external sport, and kids are not permitted to participate in external sports outside of school. So they're getting
in general, exercise in general, like you can't go to gyms, you can't do this, you can't do that, and they do have a scripture, I guess, to back that up, where it's like, exercise or physical activity, exercise, I think it is profitable for a little. So they'll use that to be like, oh, well, I'm not going to exercise. It says, it's not very profitable. So,
Yeah.
and I do remember using food as a kid as a vice to cope, because it's the only thing that did bring me comfort, were the jam donuts, were the pizza slices. And it wasn't until I grew older and realized, the meaning of the science of food, do you realize how much I used to abuse food growing up, and until I was of legal age to abuse alcohol growing up in there, because it was the only vice, the only comfort you had.
Yeah. And just on the alcohol, like I could see for those not in Australia, the legal drinking age in Australia is 18. There was kids as young as 15 abusing alcohol. You could see it. You could see the signs of being hungover.
I didn't drink alcohol at 16, 15 like the other kids, because my father didn't allow it. Like, he was super strict. So I was always, bullied because of that as well. Like, that was another reason I was bullied, because I didn't drink alcohol like the other kids.
And it made me, like you said, Ben, like obviously legal and your parents were very strict, but it made me wonder whether those kids were sneaking alcohol as a way to cope, or whether they were being encouraged. That's not something that I know the answer to, but still it was horrific either way.
I can give you an example of a couple of years back. I happened to bump into a teacher that recognised me from a different campus, and they said that they had an excursion with a certain outer west campus, and basically kids turned up with their drink bottles and their backpacks full of alcohol. Like, these underage kids, she said that all of them had alcohol, and they'd been drinking all the way down to the excursion and all the way back. And she said when they said something to the campus or the teacher, she said, I know, we searched their bags, we've already told the campuses, but the adults, that their family gave it to them, so we can't do anything about it. So they shrugged their shoulders and had to turn a blind eye, because you are not above these Brethren campus leaders. You report to them, and that's it. They are the ceiling.
Or their kids' parents. Yeah. You're not above the kids' parents.
No.
And because kids' parents run the school or have the money, you're not you can't get up against them.
No.
We had a principal from North America that told us that she had the regional person come in, and she suspected that the kids' water bottles had alcohol in them. So they went down and smelled a couple. And when they came back up, the kids accused them of sipping out of their water bottles like it was a joke. Yeah, they knew they had alcohol in them, and they didn't care. Like, it was no secret.
Yeah. And I'm not pushing a value judgment on the use of alcohol or food as a vice. I'm not pushing that at all. My concern was for kids as young as 8, that they were using vices to cope with the life that they'd been brought into. And I said that before, I don't put a value on food. Food is food. I don't talk about good food or bad food. My concern is that not only was particularly the vice of food, from what I saw, okayed as such, it was encouraged. That lunch, if that had been served in any other school, there would have been outrage from the parents and probably from the media. But because things are so closed, they could get away with that. So they were breaking laws within their schools left, right and centre, and that's just one example of that. Yeah, which was, and it was a horrifying.
Wouldn't see it as a concern. They would not see that as a concern, because it's, it's all Bible, from, based from a book 3,500 years ago written. Like, it's eat and make merry. It's, exercise is profitable for a little. It's all this mindset that they use to formulate their way of living.
Yeah, and look, we all know that information like that in the Bible taken literally is dangerous. And it's also not given historical context. The fact that that is a book that was written 2,500 or 2,000 years ago, based on the work of 2 of Jesus' disciples, and their interpretations of what happened. I'm talking New Testament here, obviously. That whole eat and be merry, that's not something that they did every day. firstly, and secondly, you know, the whole thing about exercise. Most people were involved in physical labor to survive. So they didn't need to go to the gym to keep their bodies healthy because they were doing it as part of their living.
They weren't sitting at a desk in front of a computer.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that I found really interesting was the involvement of the Brethren businesses in the school and the way that the businesses were central to the running of the school. Every child took a business management subject at year 12, which for our, I don't know how the US system works really, but my understanding is that a year 12 graduate is equivalent to second year college level of understanding. That's what I've been told, but I'm not 100% sure of that. So to say that someone who's completed their VCE is a high school graduate in the US, it's not necessarily true. But anyway, wherever they are within Australia, so there's a overarching Australian curriculum, then some states have tweaked it themselves. Within the curriculum, there's obviously business studies component, but every single child took business studies, every one of them. They have to do a maths and an English. They don't have a choice with that according to Australian curriculum standards. They have to do an English and a maths, but it was an additional that every child had to have a business management. Now, the way that that graduation is ranked, there's also school rankings, and I found it really interesting that the school rankings based on because external exams don't have as much impact on their learning on their outcomes, as what it used to. So in the dark ages when I went to school, your exam might have been worth 70% of your final score for that subject, yeah. But now it's less. It might be like 30%. So when I was there, they had a aim for 31 was the catchphrase, which means that they were aiming for a study score for the school of 31 or above, and they achieved it. Now, my question is, how? Because I've worked at independent schools with outstanding educators that don't get that level of study score. And my question is, how much of an impact was the campus overseers or the school overseers having on those marks? How much influence were they having on seeing that? Because the whole reason about having a good study score from the Brethren point of view is to ensure that more of their kids will attend the schools. So within the independent sector, having a high study score is seen as an indicator for parents who are looking for their kids to go to school at that particular school. This is a great school that will prepare my kids for university. They're not preparing their kids for university.
No, but do you think it has something to do with, is it NESA? Is that who's the governing board here that makes sure you are meeting curriculum, that makes sure you are
So each state has their own and has different acronyms. So NESA's New South Wales, VCARD's Victoria, etc. That is that study score and what creates that study score is set by VCARD, NESA, whatever it is, yeah. But my thinking is that the teachers in the schools are being asked to tweak the marking of the work they have the understanding of to get to this 31, because there is no way, from what I saw, that those kids were being given in-depth teaching and the opportunity to learn to be able to get that standard study score across the school. There's just no way.
And here in South Wales, I don't know if you had it there, but year 11 and 12, they're doing a compressed learning in a an open plan. What do they call it when you've got freedom of learning, or what do they advocate for these?
It's got a number of things, but within the looking pretty ideas, there were learning pods, so there were separate spaces where kids could work independently or with a few other places. There were classrooms, but they were all glass and open, so people could move between those.
How are they, from these open plan learning systems, how are they getting such high scores without it being tweaked? Is my assumption.
And I mean, we were told by a previous teacher that they weren't allowed to give a score below 50%.
Yes, and that is my concern, that they are fudging their results to get these study scores.
Yeah,
Sorry, Ben. Sorry, I was just going to say, because you said before why. Because they don't want to recruit outside people. They don't want to recruit other. They're not advertising to Brethrens to come to our school. Look how brilliant your kids are going to be. The Brethren don't have an option. They have to go to that school. So they don't need to advertise. They already have their market. But the only thing that the reason they'd be using that is to advocate for why they still need charitable status, why their schools need government funding. Yeah, I think there's a report from 2016 where OneSchool Global was the highest funded here in New South Wales. I might have the year wrong, but they got the highest amount of government funding. And that can be from using, having the best scores. That way places like NESA or whatever it is, whatever that board is not investigating, because they're like, well, look how brilliant the kids' marks are. It's obviously not something you'd fudge lightly. So it makes sense with you assuming that they must be.
Yeah. And the other thing is, the Australian government at the time, obviously there weren't members of the Brethren within the government at that time, but in the high level, the people who were the decision makers, so within the Australian system of government, with Prime Minister, and then we have ministers who have a portfolio of that they look after. So, for example, it might be transportation, or it might be roads. It might be education. It might be health, whatever it is. Yeah. 12 of the 16 senior ministers and the Prime Minister at that time were members of churches that I like to call happy clapper churches. So your churches that were that are seen as churches like Hillsong, for example. Coming back to the political aspect of that and the funding, and that was the case in New South Wales as well. There was a lot of I can't think of the word that I'm trying to think of. These people that make me get
fundamentalist
churches. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And they're all about freedom of religion. So my thinking is that there was a lot of within that government circle of those fundamentalist religions who were not necessarily brethren, but were all about freedom of religion. They were also receiving more funding for their schools for great marks. So they had to support that within the Brethren schools, because that's what they were expecting for their schools and wanting for their schools as well. So there's a political aspect to that as well. So
one of the things that other teachers have expressed concern over is they might recognize the signs of abuse, physical abuse, child sexual abuse, and they always felt like they were unable to take care of that or to report that or address that. Did you find that too?
So one thing that is important to understand is that teachers are mandatory reporters in Australia. They have to report if they have concerns, along with police officers, etc. So there's a big raft of people that have to report. They don't have a choice. Those teachers that report are disappeared.
Yeah, that's what they are.
Yeah, they are removed.
Feedback we're getting is the teachers that reported disappeared. The teachers that stay on are the ones that report to the CEOs, to the brethren, the brethren that run the schools. They are kept on because, well,
Yes.
you keep it, if you press for any further action, or is there any follow up, or is anything else happened, then you're disappeared. So there's no security, and then that leads the rest of the teachers who knew what was going on, because teachers talk. Well, they're not going to report it, or they're not going to, even though it's mandatory, they're not going to upscale it to, yes, they might tell a brethren system, but within the system, but they're not going to push it any further because, well, their job then is at risk.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose I'm lucky because I'm more experienced, but if you're a graduate teacher or someone who's just entering the profession, which I'll talk a little bit more about the treatment of the graduate teachers in a second, you are not going to know that you're actually breaking the law by doing that. You're not going to understand the implications of that you are actually breaking the law, and that you can end up being charged for that. In the time that I was there, I did not see signs of physical, emotional, or sexual abuse against the kids that I was teaching. That being said, I wasn't there for that long that I would, because there was a raft of reasons why I ended up leaving.
Do what you obviously care for kids, you're working with them. So care for them. Come forward and tell your stories. We beg you, because the lifelong consequences of the effects of abuse never go away.
No.
These kids are with them from their relationships to their jobs to intimacy within relationships, because of a position whereby, somebody could have stepped up and said, hey, no, this is not okay.
If you are in a high-demand religious group and need help, please go to oliveleaf.network. To share your story or be a guest on the show, email info.getalife@proton.me. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to Get a Life, and comment.